Hey, welcome to the Heroes Wellness Collective podcast. I have three really cool guests on today to talk about veteran storytelling. It just so happens that all of our guests are also from the North Carolina region. We'll go around and let each of them kind of speak to, the storytelling that they do and their background, and then we'll move through some questions. So, Stan, I'll go ahead and I guess start with you since on my frame right now, you're on the left. We'll go left to right, but Stan has, pretty diverse background: preacher, animal caretaker, YouTuber, soldier. I know you have a book of poetry get ready to come out, but also been involved in filmmaking and lots of other pursuits. So give us a little bit of your background and how it led you to where you are now with storytelling.
Yeah, I'm Stan Lake. I'm from North Carolina. I served in the North Carolina Army National Guard and fell into a war. But I grew up chasing animals and either photographing them or trying to write little stories about them. And then during my deployment, started making videos. Most of it was about me kind of doing either jackass stunts with my buddies or catching wildlife in Iraq when we weren't supposed to be. Then we put together a film about that called Hammer Down. And that's kind of opened up a lot of doors for me to keep doing more videos. The time after Iraq, I spent with the buddy I served with, and he and I kept filming the wildlife videos, but in North Carolina. And we called that Catching Creation for a number of years and did a YouTube channel with that. And I've always used storytelling as a way to process trauma or just process life. So whether it be with a camera, with a pen, or video or whatever, I've always just kind of done that as a way to work through issues and maybe try to offer some sort of joy as like an offset to the stuff that we've all probably lived through. So yeah, and like you said, I've lived a myriad of lives. I was while I did that for a number of years, but it was weird. Like I brought snakes into schools and churches and told them that God loved. It was a real weird ministry. It didn't pay very well, turns out. Government as a Department of Veterans Affairs claims processor. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
Hey, Stan, so how was that? I mean, you've had several unique transitions, but on the storytelling, how was transitioning from filmmaking to writing? How did that transition go for you?
There's never really been a transition. Everything is kind of in tandem with one another. I mean, I think writing was my, I was writing articles 20 years ago, not thinking much about it. Just I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how to do it. And I had a couple articles published in some small magazines and then one national magazine and then nothing for 20 years. But I would keep a blog here and there. I wrote some children's books about a decade ago, and just as I get these little creative inklings, I would write things. I didn't get real consistent with it until about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But yeah, so for me, there's not really much of a transition. I just kind of ebb and flow with different creative pursuits. Yeah, I don't really know how to answer that.
No worries, Stan. We'll give you some time to think. I'll move over here to John. Hey, John. So from growing up in West Virginia, joining the Marine Corps, kind of the career from Force Recon through, the stand-up of MARSOC and great military career. Then all of a sudden, shift, Master of Fine Arts. How did that go, John? Can you explain how you came to that?
Yeah, I was, always a really big reader, always kind of pictured myself writing at some point in the future. But really, I think it kind of came down to when I decided that I needed to use my GI Bill and I was going to use every penny of it. I wanted to take a master's degree that did not, the stipulation was it doesn't require like testing, the GMAT or whatever. I was not prepared for that. So among the degree paths that did not was the Master of Fine Arts program. And, when I looked into it, it was kind of rekindled, the idea of wanting to write, wanting to tell stories. And so it's been, I got that a lot when I realized, that I was the only military guy in my cohort. And, I was scared of walking in that class. I've said it quite a bit. I was more scared of walking in that classroom with 20-some-year-olds, a few 30-some-year-olds than I was walking down, a street in Baghdad. I was terrified. But, you kind of commit to something like that and you learn. And I learned so much from all of those folks. So it was a great experience. And it led, obviously, to the opportunity to publish some of my memoirs in a book called Tough Rugged Bastards.
Yeah, and since you brought up Tough Rugged Bastards, your story of your career and then the stand-up of MARSOC, how did that come to be? Who was the first push to, hey, John, you need to put this in the book? Was it worth? You can tell me if it was.
We certainly talked a lot about writing. When I went to UNCW for the program, you had to apply as either fiction, nonfiction, or poetry. And I realized that writing nonfiction was going to have to go through the review process that military writing incurs. And so I wound up studying fiction. And it was another writer, a lady named Carol Avery, that really kind of read something that I wrote and pushed me to send it to her agent. And that kind of led to, I hadn't really thought seriously about it, but he was able to kind of quickly get me a book deal that forced me to write that story pretty rapidly.
Cool. And switch over here to Worth. And Worth, I know you've done a lot of things to encourage writers. You edit a lot of stuff, but I want to start with the first part, your transitions, because you've had a couple of unique transitions as well. Law school, out there, Marine Corps reservist, 9/11 happens, and you're back all in to the Marine Corps, and then also along with John helping stand up Marine Corps Special Operations. So what did that feel like, or what pushed you to make some of those decisions from law school back into the active duty?
A lot of it is just I despise being bored. And while some of the practice of the law is super interesting, I got pulled out of law school after my second year to go to Iraq with Force Recon. And so, led a platoon over in Western Iraq for 7 months and came home, and I was in no headspace to be a prosecutor, which is what I did for my first semester back as an intern. I was working in the felony division of the First District of Florida and trying cases. And I just couldn't wrap my head around it. And the Marine Corps was looking for people to come back in, and all my friends from Force were starting MARSOC. So that's what I'm going to go do. And my wife was kind enough to make it feasible. And so, I went back in and I did that for 16 more years. But along the way, I knew who John was. Everybody kind of knew who John was. But we hooked up around, when I got back from JSOC, so 2012.
Yeah.
And we were both running ultras along with you and both pretty into it. And so we were spending, of course, 10s and 20s of hours together talking about this kind of stuff. And then John wrote a piece that is part of Tough Rugged Bastards that was in Consequence magazine. And that, and a piece that a Master Guns buddy of mine named Chris down in Tampa wrote, I thought, man, I want to do that. And so I started doing that, and it kind of operated in fits and starts until about 2019. And then it started becoming a thing. And so by the time I retired in 21 and connected with you over the Kabul evac, I had an agent, and I kind of had a little bit of an exit plan from the Marine Corps, although it was definitely part of a, row the boats ashore and light them on fire kind of proposal.
Yeah. You guys you and John are both destroying all of those negative stereotypes that people might have about Marines that don't really.
I can grunt and click as well if I need to.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. And knowing both of you guys and knowing the intellect involved, it just makes me giggle anytime somebody uses one of the negative Marine Corps, attributes of like that. You clearly don't know any, so. But your three sort of different approaches here to coming into writing, what compelled you? Was it the story compelling you? And what about that?
I think it's more of a compulsion. Like I have to write. I have to do creative things. It started with writing poetry in middle school to process through different emotions, or being in hardcore bands growing up and writing lyrics about the things going on around me. And not realizing that means I'm a writer. I just thought this is what I was doing for this season or whatever. But it's one of the things that I think it's very important to tell our stories, but sometimes I do it without even realizing it's what I'm doing. I just need to write, like for my own edification. And sometimes it helps other people, that I've learned when I do put those things out. So that's kind of been my experience. And real quick caveat, Worth and John are like super awesome dudes, obviously, but they're responsible for a lot of the things that I've done with writing. Worth with me as far as an editor, I wouldn't have considered myself a writer until Worth eviscerated some things I wrote and showed me how to get it. And then John Dailey, I even told you, I took your fiction class, rather, your short story class. I had no intention of ever writing fiction. Just took it because you were a cool guy and wanted to learn from you, and read a lot of the stuff that you told us to read. And since then, I'm like, this is really cool. I've started writing, nobody knows that, but I write those things in the background, and I really appreciate both of you guys for that. So just wanted to get that out before we got too much further. What you guys do.
Super cool, Stan. And John, for you submitted a story and you got an agent now write a memoir, but why do you think that became like a good vehicle for you?
For me, I had the great, incredible opportunity to be picked to kind of help bridge the gap between what was Force Recon and what became MARSOC. And so it was a unique opportunity at time, and it was, just full of incredible people. So it was an opportunity to tell that story that really wasn't well known. That was absolutely part of it. Unlike Stan, unlike Stan, I think it's really important that we tell our stories. Unlike Stan, I don't feel like a compulsion necessarily where I have to write. But, more and more, I think anytime we sit down to write, whether it's for publication or it's just a process of getting things out of your head and getting them on paper. And you realize that they're a lot easier to deal with, when they are on paper. So for me, it was capturing that time in history, capturing my thoughts and feelings during that deployment and kind of the subsequent events. And it was also, a way of trying to get back to all the guys I worked with that were, all long ball hitters.
Yeah, cool. And Worth, I know you work for a myriad of publications, and that's both a way to get your voice out and to help others. I've seen you gravitate more to that medium. Why is that?
I mean, honestly, it's immediate gratification to an extent. I mean, flash to bang, for the time I pitch a magazine to the time I see a story in print can be 18 months sometimes, but it's a quick paycheck. It's a real answer. And it's something I like doing. I figured out when I retired from the Marine Corps, I didn't want to be back in a hierarchy. I wanted my own thing, whatever that may be. And so I just started writing these short pieces. I would like to be a fiction writer. I think fiction writing is, to me, the ultimate expression of the art. But what I gravitate to and what I just kind of seem to be able to do is we'll call it creative nonfiction. Take some of the truth and figure out the truth that emerges from it. And try to do that in 2,000 to 5,000 words in a way that will matter to people and make them think or make them feel or what have you. And so I really enjoy that, but it also is, writing is not you don't get rich doing it unless you're, one of the long ball hitters, to use what John said. If you're Stephen King or you're John Grisham, yep, you got mansions and boats and planes and whatnot. But if you're the average American writer, you're making about $6,500 a year, and that's not doing a whole lot for you. So I like the pace of always working and always generating stuff. I like that I work a lot in the hunting and fishing and outdoor world because I like hunting and fishing and being outdoors. And I feel like if somebody's paying me to support my habit, that's pretty cool. And I get to have a lot of unique experiences. I'm heading out to South Dakota in October to hunt a guy's 148,000 acres. And he has the largest bison herd in America. And I've never seen the largest bison herd in America, and I'd like to. So, I mean, those kind of things are really neat for me. And honestly, to kind of turn a compliment back on Stan, we're all linked, myriad of ways. You, John, and I certainly through long runs for days. But I met Stan through the guys at Dead Reckoning Collective, who also have had a lot to do with John. And that is a great center point for veteran writers. And I don't honestly know exactly how or why Keith connected Stan and I, but I started watching this catching creation videos and was, immediately enamored. And I watched a ton of them with my kids. Stan's just got a really, really neat way of imparting his enthusiasm for animals that not everybody's enthusiastic about in a way that's a blast to watch. And I'm still convinced he ought to be a bazillionaire because of it. But That just goes where it goes.
Yeah. And Worth, you mentioned something there, one, watching Stan or working with Stan, but I also know, as an editor of primarily veterans voices on Substack, Lethal Minds, have you seen that therapeutic effect with some of the people that you're working with as they?
Absolutely. So I do a number of things. I am the editor-in-chief of the Tom Begbie Field Journal, which came about because I got internet ordained and I was performing a Raiders wedding. And the best man at that wedding happened to be starting this business that is now Tom Begbie. And a couple years later, after I'd been published in some analogous places, he called and said, "You want to write a monthly column?" And a year later, it was, "That monthly column's working out pretty well. You think you could find some more writers and we can make this a thing?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. Okay." So we did that. And then, I wrote a book called Always Faithful, which is a super original name for a book about Marines. And that came out of the Kabul evacuation. It's about now Lieutenant Colonel Tom Schumann and his interpreter from when he was lieutenant in Afghanistan, Zainul Azaki. And so that book happened. And then Tom and another guy started this Lethal Minds Journal with the idea that the average E1 to 03 does not have a place to really offer their thoughts. The Marine Corps, you have the Marine Gazette, which is a great place for 04s to pontificate at length about supply chain management or, other things. But there's nothing for a smart E5 who really has a cool idea. And so we created this thing for it to be kind of the voice of the barracks. And definitely some people have bought in. We have a lot of repeat players where it's an all volunteer staff. It's almost all vets, but not entirely as far as the editorial staff goes. But it is a place where if you have a DD-214 or eligibility to have one, you can write. And we exist to help you get over the hump. I think my fellow folks here can attest. A lot of writing venues, it seems like they exist to tell people no. And I've certainly been told no by, every literary journal I've ever submitted to. And we wanted to have a place where, okay, yeah, maybe you didn't do that great in English in high school, but you've got ideas. And we'll help you get it over the hump. We'll give you 3 rounds of editorial support to get you where we think it's publishable, and we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. If you can't do it after that, we might have to cut bait, but that's a place we work. And then that led to the North Carolina Veterans Writing Alliance contacting me and asking me if I would export their writing therapy program developed at the VA in Asheville, North Carolina, over to the eastern end of the state. And we ultimately did that. And that led to Dr. Jessica Dunham, who's the staff psych at the Intrepid Spirit Clinic aboard Camp Lejeune, asking me if I could adapt that 8-week program into a 4-week program as part of the TBI clinic at Camp Lejeune, which is a 5-week total, but 4-week therapeutic program for folks with TBI and just other service connected stuff, active duty people. So I did that. In fact, I did the first of 1 4-week cohort today. Came straight here from that. So I have seen it be hugely impactful for folks. I have watched an 80-year-old Vietnam vet go from being unable to be on a Zoom talking about writing and reading his writing about Vietnam in the years since without breaking down into tears, into being able to help other vets and advise them on kind of, where they're going. So yeah, I think it's phenomenal for the right person.
Yeah, I got nothing but respect for all of the programs that you've been involved with. And as you continue to evolve these programs and integrate with VA, super, super cool to watch. Switch over here to John. John, we're talking about the veteran population. I know you're still working with active duty raiders. Have you adopted any of these storytelling techniques? Have you imparted any of that graybeard wisdom down to the young raiders, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, best part of my job, and Worth and I talk about this all the time, that there are plenty of things about it that I don't like, but I get to hang out with young raiders and not so young raiders every single day, in the gym with them. I get to teach quite a bit, and I've started a coaching program where some of them will just come in and get performance coaching, and it's I always, recommend that, to anyone who's having, any sort of, issues with something is, an outlet is to write it down, whether you hope to have anyone ever read it, whether you reserve it for, a spouse or your children at some point, or whether you try to get it published. There's a broad range there, but step one is taking the things that are in your head and putting them on paper. So that's absolutely something that I encourage. And I think storytelling, we're storytellers by nature, as a species. We survived because we could tell better stories than other people, evolutionally. So, I think, I've learned over time that, when talking with young Marines, anytime that you can use a story, a good story, you stand a lot better chance of having them understand what you're getting at than just kind of the normal, what is often the Marine Corps way or the military way of do it because I told you to do it.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot, right? Stan, we're talking about working with veterans and classes, and I know that you teach a class. Could you talk to us about how you see people transition during the course that you teach?
Yeah, and forgive me, my dogs are going nuts because there is my driveway.
That's saying
I apologize for any barking. But actually, I took Worth's class, actually, is the writing class he teaches with brothers and sisters like these, I believe was the organization. And same deal as with John. I just took it on spec that Worth's teaching it. I want to be a part of it. Just loving it and learning how to process through these prompts that he gave. And we had someone in the class that I was taking of his that was sitting, I guess, auditing his from another organization. They recruited me to teach for them. So I do a class very similar to Worth's through the Veteran Creative Arts program, and actually starting it tonight again, the next 8-week session of that, where we give the guys prompts, and it's really great to see. I think I had the same guy that Worth was talking about, Vietnam guy, that he's been in all of mine and several of the ones I was in with Worth, that it's great to see these guys transition from not wanting to even acknowledge that they're veterans or being ashamed of their service or they weren't good enough or they didn't do this enough or whatever, and realizing that we're all veterans. There's no better than or worse than, we all just did different stuff, but it's allowing them to see there's a community of like-minded individuals. And my experience is hearing the Vietnam vets lament the same things that I'm struggling with, the same issues with, lost causes or wars or whatever, and hearing them talk about that, and then realizing 20, 30 years later, in my time of service, that it resonates the same. So I think that's the beauty of it. The writing is almost just a vehicle to get these guys together to share whatever that is. And so it's almost like the backbone to get guys talking, and getting them writing or being creative is just kind of an avenue to get them to get out of their heads. And I've been a benefactor, and I'm proud to be able to help facilitate it now with the organization that I'm working with. And I love doing it. I mean, you see people that everybody says they're not writers, and they'll read something that blows your socks off, and you're like, what are you talking about? You were able to communicate that, they lived through this, and now you're telling this, and you've survived the other side of it. So I really enjoy being a part of that and giving back. And yeah.
Worth, you heard Stan mention a couple of problems. What do you see as some of the biggest obstacles to veterans who are transitioning storytellers that they have to overcome to become better storytellers?
Well, I mean, I think I quote a friend of mine all the time, and Stan and John both know this guy. He's a Western Carolina novelist named David Joy. And I reached out to David. We were part of the same Facebook group 10 years ago. And I just saw his name, and I'd only recently read his debut novel. And I was like, hey, are you the guy that wrote this book? And he's like, well, yeah, I am. Okay. And a friendship was born. And I thought writing was something that, special people did. And I was not a special person. To my mind, and I didn't know I didn't know the mechanics of it. I didn't know the business of it. I didn't know anything about it. And in fact, I'll tell you, when I was in law school, I took legal writing my first year, 2 semesters, because you're required to. I failed my first assignment. because the Marine Corps had taught me to write in passive voice. And I wrote entirely in passive voice. And I got a big red F, and the professor was like, well, this thing is rife with passive voice. And I said, I don't know what that is, much less how to fix it. So I really felt like defeated. And then when I went back into the Marine Corps after law school, I worked for a guy I'd been deployed with who got shot up badly enough in Iraq that he had to retire as a 28-year-old. He had already been a magazine editor before he came in. And he would shred my one-page policy papers I'd get assigned to write. He'd just come back just dripping with red ink. And he said, I put a yellow sticky on one time. It just said, "It's your native effing language, man." And I was like,
speak it English.
yeah, I that's kind of how I felt. I was like, dude, I just graduated law school. I feel like I'm not dumb, but I had to learn all that kind of stuff. That's not the obstacle. The obstacle is the willingness to be who you need to be to tell your story. And that brings me back to David Joy, who is a 6'5", 240-pound country boy from a part of Charlotte that no longer exists. And he said to me, if you want to be a writer, you got to be fearless and vulnerable. And I was like, well, I'm a Marine Raider. Like, fearless, we do. Got it. Except, obviously, a lot of times you fake it till you make it. But whatever. You fake it if you got to. But fearless is fine. It's my stock in trade. Vulnerable, not so much. And then when I really reflected on what David had said, I thought, you can't be either one without being the other. If you're charging a machine gun nest, you're fearless and vulnerable. And if you are spilling your guts out on the page, and tapping a vein and bleeding, as Hemingway said, then you are, again, fearless and vulnerable. And the first time I ever pushed send on something that I wrote to somewhere that people would actually read it, I physically cringed as I did it. But I did it anyway. And it has been incredibly rewarding. And so that's why I say to the folks in the therapy groups or to people that I coach or just to folks I'm having a conversation with, you start writing until you feel nervous and then dig in until you're truly scared and then dig in some more till you're bleeding on the page. And then you'll know where you need to be. And that's hard for folks from our background.
Yeah. I've had a friend of mine who's a writer. She told me, she's like, no tears in the author, no tears in the reader.
Right.
Yeah. She's like, if you didn't move you to write it, it's not going to move anybody else to read it. So
yeah, let your inner monologue become your outer monologue. And I have discovered that I expected people to say, like, man, I never knew you were so weak. And in reality, I've had a uniformly positive experience of, real life tough guys saying, man, that's exactly how I always felt. Yeah, right. Exactly. Because we're all pretty much the same. We just don't like to acknowledge it. I had a guy in my writing group today at the Intrepid Spirit Clinic who I already know and who I also know to be a far better than average writer. I mean, and he is. He's been published multiple times. He just coincidentally also a Marine and in that group used the phrase, you have to earn your failure. And, as a Marine taking the Force Recon indoc, as a Marine trying to go to MARSOC, as a Marine running 100-milers, I was always seeking to earn my failure. And now I'm a retired guy and my body seems to be falling apart at the rapid rate. And the way I can earn my failure is by having the Atlantic magazine or the New Yorker tell me, yeah, no, thanks, but no. And I'm looking for those opportunities.
Yeah. So John, I'll take all those, that stew right there that Worth was put together of emotional vulnerability. I'll throw in a couple more things and toss this your way. So when you're balancing this emotional vulnerability, you're balancing your story, and then throw in another topic that's kind of, recently out in the public space, this stolen valor, right? So now you got, how do you balance truth, emotional vulnerability, what you can say, what you can't say? I mean, there's a lot of things coming in there. And I know from reading your book that you dealt with those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a tough one, and I think everything that Worth said is spot on. The one thing that I've, being someone who still works with active duty guys and writing kind of about them, is when you're in a kind of universe that prides itself on being quiet professionals, and especially a universe that makes fun of seals because like everybody, every seal, writes a book. So being one of those guys, and having to say, yeah, I've got a book coming out, I was incredibly nervous about what the Marines were still active duty, what the Marines I served with, who the book was about, what they were going to say. And I anticipated, the normal like tactical questions, like what happened on this or that. But really the biggest response that I've gotten, and it's been like, 98% of responses have been that, this imposter syndrome that you talk about in the book. I didn't know that had a name. And I didn't know it had a name when I was writing the book, but the realization that everybody, goes through that. And, we have two ways of dealing with that. We can either succumb to it and say, well, I suck and I'm not good enough. And so I'll go bury my head in the sand, or we may let it piss us off. And we say, screw you guys. If the imaginary people that don't think I can do this, I'll prove it to you. And that's been the biggest discussion that I've had with guys. And, just 2 days ago, one of the Marines was like, hey, I'm in the middle of your book. And really we had I talked about a detainee that we were questioning and my desire to choke him to death. And, we talked about, in the book, I was at that time in America, there was a lot of sentiment saying, hey, we have to take the gloves off and we have to fight the way the enemy fights. And I kind of talked about my feelings in that and acknowledged the fact that, over time, my feelings have obviously changed. But, I gave kind of my reason on why, we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And we had a really long, and it was probably one of the coolest things that's happened to me in quite a while. This relatively senior Marine, I like to say, hey, let's sit down and talk about this, about what you were thinking. And you really made me think differently. So I think I don't even remember now what the question was, Fred.
Yeah, no,
I'm not sure if I answered it.
I think you're answering, and it's all about how do we honor the people that we served with, essentially the brand that we represent, without tarnishing it, right? Without telling secrets, or without wandering into stolen valor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one, as a service member, like I said, you are required to send your everything in to get reviewed to make sure that you're not, talking about things that you shouldn't. And I had a few, things redacted, but I also sent it to, people who were there and said, hey man, please, this is the way that I remember it. One of the things that I think prevents a lot of people from telling their story, and it's kind of a heavy weight when you start, is defining truth. When you say that this is true, well, it's what you remember, right? It's what you remember now from a different time, and it's what happened from your perspective. So there's a lot of layers of, none of us are omnipotent, have the ability to put out absolute truth. So it's challenging. I think the best that you can do is acknowledge the points, in your writing where this is how I remember this happening, and, do everything that you can to fact check yourself. And I'm boggled continuously by the stolen valor, business that, I was very concerned about, just making sure that I wasn't, I did not want anybody coming back and saying, hey, Dailey, you didn't do that. I did that. Or so I was, so worried about that. And, it seems to have come across to most readers. They're like, man, this guy's really humble and this and that. I'm like, not really. I just, I want to give credit where credit's due, to all of the incredible people that I worked with. And I want to, just make damn sure that I'm not overstepping any bounds. But I was talking with someone recently, and they told me that, and it kind of hit, when they said it, that, if, we're in this realm of quiet professionals, and the only people that are putting the story out are the people that are not following that, then, you're having your story told to anybody who reads it or listens to it, by, the worst of your class. So I think it's important for those of us with stories to tell. And I think we all have stories to tell to do that.
I read your book, and it's fabulous. And you do come off as the guy that you are, the humble guy that's out there leading and doing what you needed to do. It's a great story in your book.
No, thank you.
Stan, we're talking about all these obstacles to overcome and storytelling and the things that we're juggling. And one of the things I want to introduce now is the people that are adjacent to us. So our family members, our kids. How has that personally impacted you? You know, maybe somebody in your family doesn't want you to tell a story, or one of the veterans you're working with, they're having trouble because someone in their life doesn't want them to tell a story. How does that impact you as a writer or as a coach? And Worth, if you want to jump in, or John, if you have some thoughts on that, jump in.
I guess it kind of all dovetails together a little bit. The last question in this one. And I was thinking as I was listening to John about the writer Tim O'Brien, he's written 5 or 6 books, of course, maybe more, but he wrote The Things They Carried, which I think got a National Book Award the year it came out. And the first time I read it, I was 19 years old. My mom sent it to me because she heard about it on NPR and it was a war book and she figured I'd like it. And at 19, I didn't get that book at all because what I wanted to do was read more of, like, you know, for a while there, you could, every guy in, you know, the Ranger Company for pick an infantry division in Vietnam wrote a book about his time as alert. So you could get the point man's perspective and the drag man and the RTO's book and like all 6 dudes' books, you know. We were 101st Airborne. And I read all those books and I loved them. So that wasn't at all what The Things They Carried was. And then I fast forward to, I'm 45 and I'm a beat down lieutenant colonel at the Pentagon. And Tim O'Brien is going to be at a college in Fredericksburg talking about this book. And I went down, I still had my first edition copy that my mother had given me, but it was packed up. So I bought another first edition and I drove down to this college. And I said to Tim O'Brien, when I got a brief moment to talk to him, I was like, one, my guiding principle is I don't ever want to write anything where my old peers from the old job read it and go, I don't remember him being such a douche. You know, that's really important to me because so much of our collective identity is built on our credibility and on who we are amongst our peers and not manufacturing valor or anything like it. And O'Brien said to me, well, there's this concept, you know, and he talks about it a lot. He's written about it. There's story truth and there's happening truth. And when you read The Things They Carried, there's a scene where a soldier hits a mine and his leg ends up in a tree. That happened. Didn't happen to the guy that it happened to in the book. Another guy drowns in a rice paddy face down because the rounds are skimming so close over the top of his head. He basically has a choice to raise him up and get his head taken off by a machine gun or to lay down in the water and drown. So he drowned. That happened. It didn't happen to the guy it happened to in the book. And O'Brien was like, I needed to manipulate reality to tell the truth. And that, I think, is something important for veteran writers to understand, because a lot of times how it really happened is actually excruciatingly boring or way too complex for anybody to understand. But if you can tell the truth by telling the essence of it all in a way that everybody will agree, I understand why you did that. I think that matters. As for telling what your family doesn't, you know, maybe want to know, I've had that conversation with any number of veteran writers. One in particular who wrote something for a project that I'm working on that's very intense and very personal, and he did it under a pseudonym because he said, I don't want my kids to know that part of me. And I respect that. And I think it's perfectly reasonable. He got it out. He got it out under a pseudonym.
Yeah. Stan, you've had a moment to think about that. What are your thoughts now?
I was trying to think of an example, and I remembered I had some poems come out in the first Dead Reckoning Collective anthology for veteran poets, and I tried to read one of them to my mom, and she told me to stop reading. And this was because it was a traumatic event that happened in Iraq, and it really got me thinking about when people kind of espouse supporting the troops. Well, that's part of it. You know, it's helping us carry the load of these stories, of these experiences, not to subject people to our trauma necessarily, but I think that's why a lot of us write stuff down or share it, is so that we are able to help unburden ourselves so that, you know, we can kind of share that a little bit. But I don't know, that's been my experience with that. But I think a lot about maybe it isn't for them. You know what I mean? Maybe it's just for the guys I serve with that can relate to it. And you don't worry necessarily about what our friends and families feel about it, because even if we explained it in depth, could they understand it because they weren't there? And I wrestle back and forth with kind of that idea of is that my responsibility to bridge the gap between my experience and their understanding? I don't know. I mean, I do my best, but I don't know that they'll ever fully understand. And so I don't know that I need to bear the burden of that all the time.
I can tell you, I've been in a spot where an emotional story for me was about the death of someone else. And so when I wrote about it and hitting send to his, widow and his dad was terrified, right? Like, this is a story I need to tell. Do you approve of the manner in which I told it? And waiting for their response. That's a terrifying place to be when you're subjecting them to something they're like, hey, I really don't want to read that. But so yeah, I can totally understand what you're talking about, Stan, where maybe your experience doesn't translate, but I don't think it's always the veteran's responsibility to bring everybody along. They can come along if they want. We're to that point about this, talking about these powerful emotions. And I know you come at this from a more analytical position as an editor. How do you bridge that gap between, the analysis of, is that good writing, and how do we get the emotion or translate the emotion of the person writing?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the clearing statement I have to make here is I am completely unqualified to have the career that I currently have. I mean, I'm not even being facetious. I mean, I was a decent English student in high school. That's about it. I took a writing course that you had to take to graduate as an undergrad. I took a writing course you had to graduate to take in law school. Beyond that, I don't know. And yet here I am, the editor-in-chief of two things, and was the editor-in-chief of a third for a while. And for me, it's, how does it grab me? Does it feel authentic? Does it feel real? Does it feel forced? I'm also going to say what I'm about to say in certain capacities is completely irrelevant. And that is that a lot of times I find, veteran writing, when someone starts and they're new to it, or they just pick up a pen and go for it, which they should, it's schmaltzy, or it's inauthentic, or it's way overwrought. A lot of times it reads like a goth kid suicide note, and or like a death metal song.
Why don't I feel like giving that feedback to someone? This feels personal.
I have a million times, but only if somebody's trying to write something for publication. If we're inside the boundaries of a writing therapy thing, I tell my guys in the group that I did this morning, I'm not here to make you a writer. I will never once question your grammar, spelling, arrangement, or any other thing. I'm here to get veterans to write because I think it's beneficial for you to get some of this stuff out and to learn that you can sit and do this anywhere. You just whip out your little pad and pen and get the words out. And then it's completely irrelevant if I think it reads like something that, Morbid Angel wrote. Totally irrelevant. But if we're trying to publish something, right now, standards come into play, certain standards. And some of that is just, I know it when I see it. And so I think, can you reach somebody emotionally? Can you express yourself emotionally? Have you gone through this thing? And Stan's heard me say this a million times. Like, you got to read everything out loud over and over and over again. I wrote a 110,000 word book in 4 months. I read it out loud 3 times. That was exhausting, but it allows you to hear what your reader's going to hear as opposed to what you think you wrote. And while honestly, I did come up with that technique independently, I've since heard 2 Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award winning writers say, you got to read everything out loud. So I still feel super validated by it, but I think you do. And then you hear that stuff where you're like, I don't know, it's rough. The other example I use is I write, I'm sitting here at my desk right now, is made out of a tree that got hit by lightning in my grandmother's front yard. And I gave it to a guy who's a beautiful woodworker. And I was just like, hey man, here's some slabs, make a desk. That was my only guidance. And he made me this gorgeous desk, and it's super smooth. And I think about all the time he spent sanding and rubbing oil into this desk. And to me, that's the editing process. You're running your hands over this thing and you're like, oh, splinter. Let me get that sanded down. Let me get it figured out. That's the process of reading it out loud and hearing what you wrote the way somebody's going to read it. And so I think that helps with the whole schmaltz thing. I just also think a lot of folks, when they're new to this, are like, If I'm writing, I want it to sound important or real or whatever the word they're searching for is. And in their head, that means 50-cent words that some folks don't even really know what these 50-cent means words. They're not using them precisely. And that just takes away from the writing. So I got a sign up on my wall that says strong verbs and short sentences. That's the place to start. And then go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good transition point to something I wanted to ask Stan about his a toad in a glass jar, that unique perspective that writing sort of brings, right?
Yeah, it's the title of my book, and that was it. I didn't know anyone knew that. I guess I posted about it somewhere. Yeah, so I have a poetry book coming out through Dead Reckoning Collective called A Toad in a Glass Jar. It's slated for October 15th, but truthfully, I'll believe it when I see it. It's been about a 2.5, almost 3-year process from submitting the manuscript to getting it to market, but it's been an awesome process. So we finished the hopefully final edit last night, and I read the editor's note, and he made a good point that I hadn't thought about. I didn't realize my poetry collection, because it's broken up into a couple phases, is essentially a poetic memoir. Like it's talking kind of my origin story through the military, but the military is just a piece of it. Like it's not, they do a lot of, war poetry and this and that for collective, and it's veteran centric, but I wanted to be specific and not make that be the emphasis of what I'm doing. So a lot of it talks about growing up in the South, or it talks about wrestling with faith or the nuances of service or mental health, all these kind of issues that we probably all face collectively, veteran or not. But then there is the piece, a large section that talks about the things I struggle with in the military, the things I struggle with during my deployment, mostly being National Guard. I was only active for about 18 months, active duty, and then the training time on the other side of it. So my experience is kind of coming from that lens.
And Stan, how do you try and help others find their unique voice? Because Toad in a Glass Jar brings a unique voice.
Yeah, I'm similar to Worth in these writing classes where I tell them the exact same thing. Like we're not here to teach you how to write. I just want you to write. But you see gems left and right. And so like people will reach out offline and I'll encourage them, or I've had several people send articles offline and I'll talk through it with them about, we get them published in Havoc Journal or Lethal Minds Journal or places like that, where you want to encourage, obviously them, right? But then once you see they've got something, I try to hone in on. Again, like Worth, I am nobody. I've taken some like college poetry classes because I was an elective and random classes. So I keep stumbling into stuff. Like I'm astounded that I'm even here today with you guys. So forgive me, but yeah, that's it. It's more about just kind of encouraging people to keep doing what they're doing and then helping refine it together and learning little tips as you go, like reading craft books. I just read On Writing by Stephen King. And I think it's often easy to scoff at stuff like that, but it does really help to think what other people before me have done and what worked for them. I can apply that to my life or apply it to the life of others and help them kind of along their journey. So anytime I have a tool, I pass it along. That's how I've been helping people kind of find their voice by just encouraging them to keep using it.
Stan, you brought up something there. I think some veteran writers, and John mentioned this and Worth did as well. The early GWAT books were, hey, here's GWAT, right? Here's what I did, came off this plane and did this, and it really doesn't explore, as you were mentioning, early childhood trauma or other things in your life that made you the person that was there observing these other events or participating in other events, which lends to your unique voice.
Yeah, I think we're not the PTSD or the whatever. It's not exclusive to the military. I've heard it said, I may have some of that with me to war and it just exacerbated. So, everyone, I'm sure no one had a perfect childhood, but it's an interesting formative thing. And I think a lot of us probably joined the military one way or another because of aspects of childhood. So again, I think there's a through line of universality to a lot of it, whether you're a veteran or not. I think people can relate as writers, as creatives, to some of the themes that we probably bring up in all of our collective works.
That's good. I guess we've talked a lot about therapy and transition and how writing can change us, but So John, after your memoir, right, and you talked about, keeping it true, keeping it real, and honoring the people you served with. One, how are you changed if you are different? And then two, did it change your relationship or how you saw the Marine Corps?
Yeah, it did. I mean, it absolutely changes you. I think, publishing a book does, but, I would first say that, having a degree in writing doesn't make you a writer. The saying that, hey, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to keep hammering at this thing is what, makes you a writer. Absolutely. I mean, I learned a lot. I benefited greatly from going through the program that I did, but that program didn't make me a writer. I often say that the people in the program did, the professors that spent time with me. But, having the opportunity to reflect back on, 20 years of being in the Marine Corps, gave me a new appreciation for it. Absolutely. It certainly, because it was coming at that same time, I realized that I had, in that 21 years and in the 17 years since then, 18 almost, I've only been around Marines mostly. The people that live in my neighborhood are retired Marines. It's until I went to that writing program, that I really, it wasn't until then that I really experienced regular people. So, it's kind of being in that, kind of seeing some of the things, writing through their eyes absolutely changes you. But I think I became jaded a little bit. I think it's easy to do in the Marine Corps when you're in Force Recon or you're in a special operations unit to let yourself say, I'm in this elite unit and the rest of the Marines are the rest of the Marines. But, when you reflect back on it, you realize, what an incredibly awesome organization and a cult. I often call the Marine Corps a cult. It is, but it's a really good cult. And, it was really, responsible for making me, who I am. So I've absolutely, gained a much greater appreciation for that, for the history, and, through that time.
Yeah, I was speaking to another Marine Corps veteran who runs the Veterans Yoga Project, Brianna. And so we were talking about, the Marine Corps, and you absolutely have to give it props. One, for everything it can accomplish operationally, but on the surface, like, nobody can out advertise them. There's nobody that does it better. So we're talking about these stories, and and Stan talking about, is it your responsibility to someone else how they take the story? How do you think veteran stories impact the greater public?
I think they're huge because there's a lot of interest in what we do. Now, whether there's the kind of interest I necessarily want or not, I don't know. But this is when I was a kid, like, as I said, everything I read was like, okay, this is a 6-book series from Team 3 TAC 1 of, Alpha Company 75th Rangers or whatever in Vietnam. I read them all. I stacks and stacks of these books. And so, I could probably tell you how to do an Australian peel before I was 15 years old. But I think the real important thing as I've gotten older, and I have kind of assigned myself this mission, if I have any mission in life, is bridging this civ-military gap that I think is dangerous. You look at successive generations going back. My grandfather was a Marine. He fought on Okinawa. He got shot 3 times. He was friends with this person over here who was a Navy veteran who served in the European theater, and that person was an Army Air Corps pilot. They all had some common ground, right? And I am not a person who believes in universal military service. However, I used to be super libertarian and I was against any draft or anything like that. Now I'm all about a mandatory period of national service in whatever capacity that is best realized for the individual human being. Because I think we're seeing now the effect of decades and generations of, the dearth of a unifying experience amongst the American citizenry. So I think if our story can serve in that fashion somehow, then I think I, as the veteran, have the obligation to reach across the civilian military divide and say, I'm here to answer questions. I will answer any question that is asked in good faith, and honesty. I've had the, did you ever kill anybody question from a woman at a funeral party. And I had known her for all of 30 seconds. And it was like, hi, I'm Worth. Hi, I'm whoever. Did you ever kill anybody? That was a little early in the relationship for that. But if somebody comes at that sort of thing honestly, they need to understand that all four of us, everything we did was at the behest of and in the name of the citizenry. And they are all as culpable for anything we did as we are. And if the citizenry is so disengaged as to allow things to happen that they don't think should happen, it ain't on me, at least entirely, right? We are all connected. And so I think telling our stories and making people understand that and helping them understand the reality of what they ask when they send the North Carolina Army National Guard to war is very, very critical. I hate the word very. I beat people up for using it very. Is critical.
Get rid of it.
Yeah, you can educate the very. You can kill the very to an educated and engaged populace, and that the less we have of that, the worse off we are. So I think, and we have to be willing to do it. The whole I'm a veteran, I'm just going to be over here in the corner being silent like Rambo and live in the woods with my knife. Like that ain't helping anybody. If anything, it's hurting.
You mentioned this, civilian military divide. Is there any type of storytelling you see as particularly effective in bridging that gap, or are all of these stories helpful?
Well, I mean, helpful to me personally was, New York Times used to have a section that they ran, killed, and started up again and then killed, called At War. And it gave vets a place to write nationally and internationally and be seen. It's part of the way I got an agent. It's part of the way that I became really good friends with this guy, Casey Tellison, who wrote, as good a GWAT memoir as exists, because he also published in At War. And I think those firsthand experiences where somebody can go, okay, he's sitting there, he's got a collared shirt on, he doesn't look like a lunatic, but he's had some relatively lunatic experiences on my behalf. Maybe I need to understand better what that's about, what that experience has been. It's what, the piece that John wrote that became the Consequence article that became part of Tough Rugged Bastards is called Death Letter. And it is, I think John can correct me, I think it was like 14,000 words when I read it. It was a long essay, and it was beautiful, and it was real, and it was incredibly affecting. And then that came almost like kind of a 1-2 punch when I mentioned Chris Stowe earlier. Chris wrote a piece about being an EOD tech in Baghdad or wherever he was and chasing an IED maker down an alley after an IED blast, and the kid had already been shot. And when he got there to check the body, it exhaled, as bodies will do sometimes. And he pulled his pistol out and shot a dead body like 4 times, just kind of, reaction. And then he realized this is a 15-year-old kid. He's like, I just shot the body, maybe killed, maybe did the coup de grace, I don't know, on a 15-year-old kid. And on the other side of the earth, right about now, my 15-year-old kid is waking up and eating his breakfast. And that, reading that level of honesty and vulnerability, to use David's terms, I was not there yet. It took reading John's work. It took reading Chris's work, in Stan's, if you understand Stan's Substack, there's a lot of open heart and a lot of open vulnerability there. And I needed to see that to be able to do it myself. And I think that's a gift.
It is. And, so I'll pitch this question to John. So that any practical advice for a veteran who wants to tell their story, but maybe feels a little overwhelmed by the story, the emotions, any practical advice for getting past that, John?
No, I think it's important to put aside any hopes that you have for this thing that you're writing. Write it. Put it on paper. The paper burns. The paper tears. The paper can be erased. Or the computer can be thrown out the window. Whatever the case may be. Right? Get it on paper, and then start to nothing like that desk of Worth's. It wasn't. He didn't give a log to a guy and he magicked the desk, right? It took a lot of time. It took a lot of iterations. It took a lot of sanding. I think probably one of the biggest misconceptions is that, because somebody writes something well, that they just sat down and it birthed, like Venus out of the head of Zeus or whatever, right? It's
there.
The article that Worth talked about, Death Letter, was, I think, rejected 20 times, I believe, by 20 different magazines, and Worth chopped on it probably a dozen times, and it went from that 14,000 words probably down to 8. So there's a lot of, nobody's going to grade you or look over your shoulder, or read it until you allow them to. So there's, writing is a pretty safe place to start. And I think particularly with groups like Dead Reckoning Collective, like Lethal Minds Journal, with these other places, you're surrounded by people who are in the exact same boat that you are, and are, will, call you on your bullshit, but, are willing to give you kind of good feedback and willing to point out, where, you can be more honest, or where you can cut, or where you can improve. So I think it's just a mistake to think that, things are going to pop fully formed from your head onto paper.
Yeah, for sure. And Stan, keeping with that, John was talking about helping people get started. How do you help someone who's maybe never done anything that they consider creative, that they've never started? Do they film something? Do they write poetry? What do they do? How do you help them sort of go through the process of getting that stuff out?
Just have a conversation with them, get them talking first, and just see where their strengths are to begin with, and try to hone that strength. Like I was thinking about what John was saying earlier too, or Worth, about editing, about how it just exists from a person versus having to count, like edit forever, and then you get something that's passable. And I remember with like photography, you would take a good picture, like, well, you must have a nice camera. And they don't realize that you've put hours and hours and hours into something, into getting one shot that you've probably edited for hours after you took the shot. And I think the same thing is true with any creative venture. If somebody wants to get into it, it's as easy as picking up your phone and snapping a picture, or going into the Notes app and writing some scribbled thing down, and then passing it off and let someone look at it objectively. The beauty about the veteran community, like creative community, that I found is that it's very all ships rise with the tide. So if you need help with something, or you want to do something, there's somebody doing it, and they're probably willing to give you some tips or help you. Or there are other people in the organizations that we've all mentioned that would be more than willing to offer their help or insight. And I think that's it. What it is it all boils down to community. Whatever creative pursuit you want to do, whatever thing that you're trying to do, find that community, plug in, and then be able to find the people doing the thing you want to do, and figure out how they're doing it and why they're doing it. And that's where I always start with things like this. And that's where I try to encourage other people, like in these classes. It's not about what you're writing, it's that you are writing. Or it's not that you're taking good pictures, it's that you've snapped something and you've got a memory, now you build on it. You know what I mean? It's about building on what you've done, not creating a perfect thing, as far as that goes.
Yeah. And Worth, to carry that out, what is, like, if you could tell, a veteran, if you're talking to veterans, trying to get them to do this, what's something you tell them about the power of their story?
Yeah. Well, it's a classic story. It is a classic human story, right? Human suffering, human strife, human conflict has been recorded since recorded word was a thing. It is a plot line that people find interesting. There is drama, there is intense conflict, there's a million things that make a story good. I think what I would tell vets about it is just don't hold back. Surely, as I said earlier, a lot of it is overwrought. We can worry about the language in editing. Okay. The editing is the writing a lot of times, because, I keep every draft of everything I write, and I use it in some of these classes, and I go, here's the first draft. Here's the 10th draft that actually got published. Go line by line and see that it's almost unrecognizable. Or I worked with a guy from a special mission unit to write an essay that he wanted to get out, and it is incredibly affecting. And I know that it is now used in a number of writing therapy courses because he did a damn fine job with it. I made him do 14 rounds of edits before I told him he was done. And of course, he was the kind of personality who was like, yep, got it, dude, whatever. So, go back, do what?
So yeah, I'll keep grinding. You give it back.
Yeah, exactly. I could stay at the range all day long and do Mozambique drills, or I can edit all day long, but either way, I'm not afraid to grind. And so, yeah, to John's point, nothing that you read sprung out of a writer's brilliant pen the way that it reads now. I think figuring out what is unique about your story. What do you have to tell the world that will make us look at something differently through your lens? And that's something that John did with that death letter. He made me go, I think I want to do that. And if a guy I know can do it, maybe I can do it too. I just got to sit down and dissect how he did it and figure out, what's my angle on this thing. There's nothing new under the sun except the angle from which we come at it. And so I think people are far too quick to dismiss what they have to offer. Well, I don't have any stories. Yeah, you absolutely do. And it may be completely banal. It may be something that, I can come up with an essay out of anything. Washing laundry in the buckets at a fob. I can figure out a way to write 1,000 words about that. And I hope you're going to want to read it. So don't stress the what. Just sit down and do it. We'll make it good later.
So in that vein, where is veteran storytelling headed now?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I try to look at things historically. And of course, I read everything just about that came out about Vietnam because I was just obsessed with that war from the time I was about 11 until the time I was about 30. I have recently started going back to relatively contemporaneous World War II stories. Because for years, the World War II books I read were like the ones you pick up in the discount box at Barnes & Noble, Normandy or whatever, Bastogne. I have started discovering books that are amazing. Just in the last couple of years, there's one called Coral Comes High. It was written by a company commander who commanded, I think, India Company or whatever they called I Company back in the day at Peleliu. He was isolated for 3 days with his company, and just held this peninsula by himself. Navy Cross, Silver Star, gets out and becomes a Forbes journalist. That dude could write crazy well. There's a book that I recommend to everyone. I buy every first edition copy I can find. I mean, to own them all. And the guy's name was William Drew, and he was an OSS Jedburgh in World War II because he was from Louisiana and spoke French. And that's the reason. He was an infantry officer who spoke French. And he jumped into Normandy prior to the D-Day invasion and spent the better part of a month on the run from the Germans, just trying to stay alive. And he went back in the 50s and he walked the same ground. And he talked to the people with whom he'd been in the resistance. And it's real clear from the writing that he was deep into some PTSD like nobody talks about in those books.
Yeah.
It's just an incredible book. And so then you start realizing like there's nothing new under the sun. So why should I be afraid to reveal what I've got? And so I think we're starting to see that come with the GWAT. Like the first round of GWAT books were just the facts, ma'am, and there I was. And now we're seeing Tough Rugged Bastards, and we're seeing Freaks of a Feather. And I just read one recently by a guy down in New Orleans named Michael Petrie called 5s and 25s. And it's a novel, but it's about a route clearance platoon, which ain't sexy, in Al-Anbar province in like 2006.
What's something you think that he's learned about the healing power of storytelling?
The main lesson I've learned is to do it for you. Because if you're expecting some accolades or you're expecting to go viral or whatever it looks like, whatever creative pursuit you're putting out, doing it for the wrong reasons. So if you're doing it for you and you're truly passionate and enthusiastic about what you're doing, or you're honest in your writing, don't worry about how it's received, as long as it helped you in the process. I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned, and it's the big thing I can impart with other people.
John, how would you approach that if you're talking to people that don't feel like their story is worth telling?
Yeah, I think, like Stan said, I believe that everybody, like, Worth said, you could be on the same patrol, right, and have a vastly different experience, of a firefighter, of an IED blast, or whatever the case is. So, everyone's has a unique perspective and a unique story to tell. Some of those deserve to be published. Some of them probably don't, but all of them are valuable. And whether that's, valuable to, because you become the next, whatever, $1 million writer, or it's valuable because your kids or grandkids someday learn, what their dad or granddad or mother did, or whether it's because it just gets it out of your head and on paper. And I think that's the every veteran can benefit from that. From, hey, let me sit down and really a creative outlet, like Stan said. It doesn't have to be, writing necessarily, but, in a lot of cases, it's easier to tell, like Tim O'Brien, to tell a true story through fiction. So, change the names, change the location, change the time, and just, put your story down, get the things that are bothering you out of your head and on paper. And a lot, I most of the time find that, when something's on paper, it's a lot easier to deal with. And so I think that's hugely valuable. And then I agree with Worst's point that I think that we're probably, soon we'll see like the golden age of GWOT writing. There's one of the when I was writing mine, I went back and tried to read. There was, there were plenty of GWOT books. Not a lot of them I thought they were too close to the events to really be to have. Memoir means memory, right? Or to really have reflection. And I think to have memoir that stands the test of time, you have to have some separation from the event because it's really kind of about reflection. But so I read as much as I could, and there's a book called Quartered Safe out there by a British soldier named George Fraser from World War II that was written 40 years after the fact. And reading that, it's just amazing to see him processing these things and the recollections and the amount of kind of research that he had to do to go back and remember, what happened that long ago. And it's helpful to see too that you change, right? We're not, I'm absolutely not the same guy that I was, and none of us are. So there's, you have to see growth. And that's one of the things with a lot of times I'll tell people that, if we can learn a lot about writing nonfiction from fiction. There are plenty of books, Stephen King's and Lamont's that talk, about writing fiction. And in fiction, you have to have growth, you have to have change, or you can have regression. But you can't have a character that stays the same. And if your story of your deployment or whatever, has you staying the same, you don't learn anything, you don't lose anything, you don't gain anything, then it's probably going to be a story that needs work. But that reflection comes with time.
Yeah. Hey, gentlemen, I appreciate your time, but as we come to the end here, I'll go to Worth first. And what's the question that I should have asked you with regard to veteran?
I think, maybe one is how do I get started? Mechanically speaking, you can certainly reach out to me via Lethal Minds Journal, where we exist to publish you. Lethal Minds Journal is either lethalmindsjournal.submissions@gmail or just lethalminds.submissions@gmail.
Yeah, we'll include it in the notes here.
All right. That one, you can hit me on Instagram at B00KWAR, Book War, but 2 zeros instead of O's, because I'll put out a call for folks who want to participate for free in the Zoom-based twice a year, 8-week writing therapy groups. We meet typically on Wednesday nights around 6:37 Eastern. So, that's one question is, how do I get signed up? You just contact me and I put you on the distro. It's very easy. So I think there's that. Beyond that, like the mechanics of all this and the business of all of it, I'm going to teach a class on that at the North Carolina Writers Network, which I'm a board member of that state group, this November. I've also done that class for Dead Reckoning Collective, and understanding that if you're doing this to do it, then just do it. There is no admission fee. There's no bar to entry.
Yeah.
And there's no cops who declare whether you're doing it correctly. If you are thinking, I want to make a living at this, I want to do this as a business, it's like any other culture. There's a way to approach it. There's a way to deal with people. There's a way to carry yourself within it. And if you're at the very outset of it, it's just like being a new boot checking into a new unit. Know who you are. Watch what's going on around you, big ears, small mouth for a little while, and figure it all out. But you can always reach out to the senior lance corporal and say, hey, man, what am I supposed to be doing right now? If it's not immediately evidence, there's 3 senior lance corporals sitting on the screen right now, who can do that correctly. Do that. But again, reach out correctly, because I'll have guys email me and be like, hey, man, I saw you on this podcast. I wrote 10,000 words in crayon. Here it is. Read it. Make it better, send it back to me, and tell me who's going to pay me for it. No one. Okay.
No one, starting with me.
Yeah. But for folks who have reached out and said, I saw you on this thing, I'm trying to do it, and honestly, I don't know anything about it, I can say, 10 years ago, neither did I. Let's talk.
So Stan, same question. What should I have asked you, or what would you impart to a writer that I haven't talked about or haven't asked?
That's a good question, because I think we've covered quite a bit. I would say pay attention to the world around you. You know what I mean? Like, your experience, we've talked about, but your experience is unique, whether it's as a badass operator like you guys are, or just like a regular, normal national guy that happened to find himself in a war. I think there's a spectrum of storytelling, and often we think that people want to read about the kicking in doors and blowing things up stories, but probably the stories that aren't being told are the average experience that no one's told yet because they think it's not sexy. But there's where the stories are. There's where the lessons are. I mean, not always, but again, that aspect needs to be told as well. And I think so. Don't devalue yourself because of your MOS or your job in the military or whatever that is. You have a story to tell. You've done something unique. If you weren't in the military, you probably do something cool that people don't know about. Or, you know, you're a 42-year-old man that took dance as a child and could do splits. I mean, who knew that about me? But there it is, you know, but so there's stuff like that. Everybody's got a unique story. I think it's just honing that in and finding it and writing it. And yeah, that's that.
John, okay, your turn.
Yeah, I don't, a question you could have asked possibly was, what was the book that was most influential to us? But I think a theme that's kind of gone around, we've talked about all of the Vietnam books that we all read, behind me, behind Stan, tons of books. The best advice, I think, is if you want to write, then you've got to read. You got to read a lot. You got to read, varying things. And that helps you kind of see how other people do it. That helps you learn the craft and craft books like Stan talked about, but just, books, lots of books. And you can listen to them. That's not really reading, but it's still consuming them. I just have a problem with my wife calling listening to a book, reading it, right? But words have meaning. But however you consume them, get a lot of them in your head, and the more you do, you start to realize, hey, I could do this. This one is not really good. I could do better than this, and you can start to start figuring things out. And then obviously, as everybody else has said, there are lots of people that are willing, eager, able to help you. If you're a veteran wanting to start writing, so avail yourself of them.
All right, just like at the range, alibi fire. So are there any alibis?
I will say one last thing, which relates to things the last two guys just said. The most pernicious thing to me in the veterans community is the concept that I was just and that therefore I am not qualified to enter the conversation, or my service is not as valuable, or I don't mean as much. And Patrol Base Abate is a great outfit that Stan could talk about going to their retreats. They're a major effort there is fighting that whole concept of I was just and I think that every veteran needs to realize we didn't need the job, we wouldn't have the job. We didn't need to deploy you in the role, we wouldn't. And we're thankful that you were able to do it. And it ends there. There's no qualifier. So that's like the old World War II posters for women Marines, free a Marine to fight. Oh, shut up. Everybody contribute the thing that they can. And anybody who does something did vastly more than 99% of the American population in that regard. So tell your story.
Yeah, and I would throw in that I think one of the big issues that veterans have when they get out is finding purpose, right? And I think writing is a great way to do that. And it may not become your life's purpose, but it can certainly help, put you back into a community with other people who are also figuring things out, and with people who, have things to offer. So I think that's absolutely a valuable reason to consider sharing your story.
Any projects you want to plug?
I mean, well, obviously, I'll just continue to plug Lethal Minds Journal because it's for vets by vets, and we really do exist to put the words and thoughts and art. Both, we've done video, we've done long form fiction, we do our monthly mailing, we do interviews with what I call vetrepreneurs, which are vets who get out and start businesses. We do another interview series with writers who are not necessarily veterans, but are writing things of interest to veterans. So if you want to subscribe to that, they will get all of that for free. It will always be free. So there's that. You know, you can go to my website, which hasn't been updated in 4 years, russellworthparker.com. I used to post everything I wrote there, but frankly, as I've turned to making a living at it, the volume is faster than my cyber abilities can keep up with. So that one's good. And then, as I say, I'm the editor-in-chief at the Tom Beckby Field Journal. Google that or just go to tombeckby.com and you can read really some of the as good a sporting writers as exist in America. Folks that are publishing in Gray Sporting Journal, you know, and in the broader sporting world. We've got some New York Times bestsellers, folks like me who write for Garden and Gun magazine. So if you're into upland bird hunting and fly fishing and turkey hunting and that sort of thing, it's a lot of that writing as well as other contemplative stuff around food and travel. So that's a place that I will push folks to. And then lastly, I'll say always go read, you know, Always Faithful, where I was the contract writer for that book along with for Tom Schumann and Zainul Izaki. And there that book is. Thank you, Stan, for being the cheering section. You rock, Stan.
All right, Jensen, I know that all of you guys are on Substack, so we'll add your Substacks on here. And so people can come read what you're doing, getting your reps in. And I appreciate all of you making time today to talk about veterans and storytelling. And I've read much of what you guys have produced, and it's made me not just a better writer, a better human. So I appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for letting us do this.
Thank you.